I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we're doing a legislative wrap up here in the United States. There is just always so many policy developments in the data world that is often difficult for us to keep track of them. And that's especially true at the state level, where, frankly, there is just much more going on in terms of legislative activity. We have had several episodes in the past where we focus on these state law developments. And I think on all of them, I have asked one of my colleagues, Harsimar Danoa, to join the podcast. Harsimar is one of our lead senior associates focusing on not only all things privacy, all things AI, but importantly, all things having to do with policy developments in the United States. He spends a lot of time working with clients and tracking how legislation is moving in and out of the federal, state, and local levels here in the United States, and then more broadly around the world. So I'm very excited to welcome Harsimar back to the podcast and discuss his insights into what has been happening over the course of the early few months in 2026 and maybe what we might expect over the course of the remainder of the year. Harsimar, welcome to the podcast.
Scott, thanks so much for having me back. It's been a busy legislative season, so excited to dig in with you.
Fantastic. So, Harsimar, I'm going to loosely try to categorize some of these bills just to give us some way of trying to approach them because there are many and they go in many different directions. But for our purposes, why don't we kind of categorize them as bucket one, privacy, data protection oriented laws, bucket two, laws that are specific to the regulation around artificial intelligence, and then a third bucket around online safety, kids' privacy, those types of issues that I think are also another area where we've seen a lot of development. So maybe start with privacy. Where have we seen the development and adoption or potential or likely adoption of privacy laws at the state level?
Yeah, so for the first quarter of 2026, things were decently quiet on the privacy front. And then all of a sudden, we got sort of an upswing with two states that have actually had comprehensive privacy laws that made it over the finish line, and one that is very close to it. So, two states that managed to get it done were Oklahoma and Alabama, and Louisiana now has a bill that's passed out of the legislature and is sitting with the governor.
So I think one of the things that people are always going to ask whenever these new states come online is what is different about these laws compared to the many other laws that are already on the books. We've gone through this over and over and over again ever since California adopted the CCPA in its original form, and then that itself has evolved. So from your perspective, what are the notable differences in Oklahoma and Alabama and soon, hopefully, Louisiana as those states' laws take effect?
So the good news is that the differences are really around the edges for these three. The state legislatures really seem to be responding to the momentum that's been attached to the framework outside of California, the sort of Virginia, Colorado, et cetera model. And with that, there's a lot of synergies compared to that existing regime. But as you noted, I think every state wants to be slightly unique in how they approach some of these frameworks. And so we do have, some differences. Things like Louisiana is one of the few states that actually includes just a revenue threshold as part of its applicability criteria, which for other states that typically tend to focus on how much data you're processing only as the criteria, this is going to be one that has the potential to bring in more companies or organizations. We've also seen some differences at the edges around some of the definitions that are there. In particular, we're starting to see differences where the sales definition now starts to have carve outs for certain types of analytics or marketing activities that we don't typically see these carve outs in other states. Practically speaking, for most organizations, you'll probably want to at least be aware of, some of these nuances, but I'm not sure that it's going to materially change a lot of compliance approaches, especially if you've already started to build out your program to deal with the vast majority of other states.
So, what do the three of these states mean for the prospect of potential federal legislation in privacy? Obviously, that's always been an area of question marks, and I think we probably have our own personal views about the ultimate likelihood of that happening. But there has been some federal proposals that are out there, including some that have captured some of the attention of the media, where there could be the prospect of at least proposed federal legislation.
Yeah, there's a little bit of push and pull, I would say. So, on one hand, we're just seeing more growth of that patchwork that a lot of organizations have struggled with and have really called for federal legislation to kind of create a single uniform standard that can be applied across the country. The slight good news is because there is this sort of harmonization, it does in some degree reduce some of that pressure that organizations are feeling. The challenge that still remains, though, is that even if you have the same standard in the same law across different states, those states can interpret those requirements slightly differently. And so we're starting to see some of that where even certain pieces that you might consider to be relatively standard, like purpose limitation provisions, California in particular is starting to push on that front more aggressively. And so even those consistent provisions can still be a source of differences in interpretation.
Yep. That combined with the fact that there is no one federal privacy bill means that we not only have the differences of potential interpretation for language that on its face looks the same across those state laws, but we also have an increasing number of regulators, all of whom feel entrusted with the enforcement of their law. So, in some ways, this starts to look more like the GDPR in some ways, where even if you start with a common framework, and obviously the GDPR is a much more common framework that we do in the United States, but you start to see member states and specifically the DPAs in those member states take different views of those laws, even if they're written the same way.
Exactly. And I will say, as we have seen some federal proposals, typically they've supplemented FTC enforcement authority with enforcement authority by the state AGs. And so even if we were to get a standard that preempted state laws, there's still the potential for some of this, the equivalent of member state DPAs sort of trying to advance their own individual theories. That said, when we look at other existing frameworks that have this type of regime in place, COPPA is the one that comes to mind. The state AG activity there has been, I would say, relatively tempered when you look at sort of the full time that COPPA has been around.
So, Arsmar, maybe we go to the next bucket of laws, and that is artificial intelligence. Obviously, artificial intelligence has been a top of mind issue for many of our clients who want to understand, what does it mean for the lawful use of artificial intelligence in a variety of different contexts. Artificial intelligence, importantly, is a technology. It's not itself something that is exempt from all of the existing laws that apply to any type of technology, including AI. But for this second category, we have a growing list of states who have sought to legislate around that technology itself, and importantly, how things like data may be able to be ingested in that technology and how that technology needs to be governed and the types of notices that need to be presented to people. And so lots of situations where there is perhaps a little less uniformity in terms of approaches around how to address artificial intelligence than you were describing in the privacy world. Namely, Colorado had adopted a pretty comprehensive AI law that maybe is not very similar to the EU AI Act, but at least in terms of its approach, had more things in common with the EU AI Act than some of the other laws in terms of its scope and applicability. Now, Colorado, I think, has gone back to saying, hey, let's revisit what we did. And maybe there is some room here for us to change our approach, What have we seen in Colorado and in other states?
Yeah, so we actually just recently saw Colorado Governor Jared Polis, who actually signed the updated version of the Colorado AI Act, which takes that broader regime that you were talking about. That I think a characterization to the EU AI Act and its comprehensiveness is fair. And the new framework is actually, I would say, a lot more tailored. In particular, the focus is now on specifically automated decision making technologies that are being used to quote unquote materially influence consequential decisions. And so we're seeing a regime that is a lot less programmatic and instead focuses more around targeted transparency, explanation, and consumer rights. That really is sort of more narrow in scope.
What have we seen outside of Colorado?
So Connecticut is actually a big player that I think has now come out into the national stage with a law that it passed, SB 5, which is an omnibus AI law. It's different than what the Colorado AI Act was in its comprehensiveness. Instead, what Connecticut has done is basically take different proposals that relate to AI and sort of put them together into a composite bill that pushes a lot of these forward. The biggest one I think that stands out is that there are key provisions that address the use of AI in the employment context that have some hallmarks similar to what we have seen in with the new Colorado model as well as New York's local law 144. And so we're starting to see again, rather than try to push for, shoot for the moon and try to get everything all in one go, really identifying the pieces that will help to directly address where there's the most concern while also, not going so far as to try to do something that's going to solve the problem of AI in one bill. If that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the quote problem with AI, is one where we will continuously see areas of focus. I think the areas that we have seen a lot of attention is, to what extent will AI create unique issues for labor and for employment contexts. And we've also seen a lot of attention around how AI works with different types of chatbots that individuals in the United States start to play with. And so both of those, maybe could be framed around problems that have been identified and largely covered in the media and have captured the attention of regulators. And so they've become very specific areas where legislatures or regulators seek to try to address, as opposed to thinking about the broad aspect of AI. What have you seen around those two areas in particular?
You're right that there's been a lot of momentum, particularly on those fronts. And I think even where the example that comes to mind is, some of this legislation around AI companion chatbots, even where some organizations may think, oh, I don't have and a companion chatbot, at least when I first hear the term, so I don't need to worry about these bills. Really, the devil's always going to be in the details. And while there's a lot of well intent in terms of framing some of these bills, sometimes when it comes to the drafting, things can be drafted pretty broadly in a way that can inadvertently, I'll say, capture other types of technologies that, maybe you don't think of yourself as an AI companion chatbot provider, but the way that the definition's framed, if you have a customer service chatbot, it's possible that there may be some inartful drafting that pulls that in. And so these are, I think, key pieces where it's always helpful to see where that momentum is, because when there's a problem to solve, sometimes we see a lot of desire to move quickly with the legislative drafting. And unfortunately, when that happens, sometimes there's other parts of the market that get caught up in that, even when they weren't the, direct focus.
Yeah, 100%. And my guess is that that will continue to happen, just given the popularity of things like chatbots. And may I say, chatbots in connection with employment and the workforce, which I think those two areas are probably headed directly toward one another, especially as organizations increasingly attempt to leverage the power that chatbots can provide with their own workforce and unlock a lot of the data that they maintain with inside of their enterprise environments using chatbot technology. And my guess is there will be other shoes, probably multiple, that will continue to drop on the overlap between those two issues.
That's right, Scott.
So maybe our smart third bucket that we started out with, which was online safety, this has obviously been an area where you see a lot of bipartisan support to try to address some of the risks that, parents have, that communities have about how kids and teenagers are using social media, using the internet, and the variety of ways that that can result in risks to them, both physical risks being, areas around psychological risks, and a number of different areas where we're seeing attention and evidence that is being captured by regulators and legislatures to try to take some action to address that more sensitive population. Kids and privacy has probably always mustered the bipartisan support and call it vigor to try to address that population, and online safety is probably no exception. And we're starting to see these design codes pop up and areas where there are specific targets to try to help address this problem. Where have we seen that over the course of the first part of 2026?
So South Carolina actually has been the most recent state to pass one of those design code laws that you were talking about. And they sort of gave it a short amount of time in terms of when the law actually took effect. But overall, these online safety, I think you're right. There's a lot of vigor and sort of momentum to try to put something in place. It's also the place where we've seen the most by way of litigation around to what extent these laws are actually permissible under the Constitution. And so really there's sort of a cycle here around some of using South Carolina as an example, some of the earliest age appropriate design codes get enacted, get challenged in court, and then states try to iterate over time to try to see, okay, where can they go forward that still moves the ball on the issue while dealing with some of the constitutional issues that come to bear. The other key area, not just related to the design codes, but age verification has been sort of the biggest topic that we've seen a lot of momentum on. In particular, California had previously passed a bill, the Protecting Our Kids from Social Media Act, that had been challenged in court. Certain parts of it were actually allowed to move forward, including the age verification portions. And we actually just saw the California AG just recently initiate a rulemaking on what that age verification might look like. And so we are seeing the conversation move forward. It's not just a sort of ping pong back and forth where it's at a standstill. But it really is a developing space that kind of needs to be closely monitored. Particularly, as I said earlier, sometimes the drafting is inartful, and even if you don't think of yourselves as having to deal with kids' privacy or online safety issues, you may get pulled in just based on the way something was framed.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And, as you mentioned, we are lumping these three together in, one episode. Every one of them has kind of unique applications that we could probably spend more time in future episodes dissecting. But importantly, this is, what we were the first 5 months here in 2026. Some state legislatures are still in session. Many, or a few state legislatures, I should say, have year-round sessions. And we may still see developments in the legislative world that are going to go into these three issues and maybe some others, including cybersecurity, that we didn't talk about today. So maybe, Arsma, kind of using your crystal ball for a moment, any things that you're watching around, potentials for legislative movement over the course of the next few months in 2026?
Yeah, the one that I think is the clearest place where there's just probably the most momentum is around those AI companion chatbots. And what exactly that legislation looks like can vary, right? There are some that are really just focusing on make sure that you're disclosing that the person is dealing with a chatbot. There are others that are sort of taking even more extreme steps to say we want to prohibit access for people under a certain age, or somewhere in between. Um, and again, the devil is going to be with the details of that in terms of how they're scoping the concept of a companion chatbot versus, like you were mentioning, a chatbot that you might use in the context of employment or in customer service. So that, I think is probably the biggest target that comes to mind. The next one where, I think it may have been after we last spoke, but we're just seeing more activity around state proposals for what I'll call like age signal bills, where the idea is that an app store or a operating system provider is going to take certain age verification steps and then provide developers on that platform with a signal about how old the user is. And this is one where, again, we've seen challenges against some of these frameworks, but there really is a clear appetite to try to figure out who is going to own responsibility for certain age verification activities. But it's something to keep a close eye on because for a long time, the framework was, we don't service people who are under 13 or under 18, and we don't know if they are. So, it's not like we knowingly provide services for those individuals or use their data. But these types of age signals can really change the dynamic where if all of a sudden you're required to ingest these signals, you may find out more about your customer base than you had previously known, and it may require certain compliance shifts once you have that information in hand.
Yeah, 100%, and probably put a lot of emphasis around the accuracy of those signals from the very beginning, because, as you and I both know from our practices, one of the most difficult issues that is impacting a broad range of technology is identity. And how is it that you establish identity in an otherwise anonymized setting, like the internet? And how is it that you track identity over time? Because it seems as though there is a common expectation from regulators and legislatures who are like, oh, of course, you know who these people are. And thus, they put a whole bunch of obligations on them. And that's an assumption that importantly has a capital A in it because it's very hard for many organizations to understand who people are and try to track them over a period of time. And in fact, as you're pointing out, we don't necessarily even want to do that or encourage it because it presents kind of a whole bunch of other secondary issues that we in companies may want to avoid. So great call out for things to watch for in the future.
Yeah, Scott. And I will say, I do think we're seeing a lot of lawmakers turn to the idea of technology as the solution to try to, get at some of these issues. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of these types of proposals in other contexts as well.
Well, Harsimar, we'll have to have you back to not only talk about those future developments, but also to try to dissect some of the ones that we already on our horizon as companies are responding to these new requirements and updating their existing programs to address the net new obligations. So really appreciate your time today and sharing your insights with our Data Chronicles audience.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Lachlan. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.